Welcome to the Untold Civil War. I'm with Detective Robert Girardi. We will be discussing Civil War myth busting. It's a new segment that we're doing, and so far it's been quite interesting. Today, we're going to be discussing a common misconception that actually might hurt some people's feelings, but it's often said that the South got all the good generals. What can we talk about in regards to that?
Well, I think we have to, and I think you'll find this in general. I've had people come up to me over the years, either roundtable meetings or a presentation or whatever. Well, isn't it true that the South got all the good generals at the beginning of the war? And they believe that. And I don't know what how this got started, but I think if they're talking primarily, and most people when they talk about the Civil War are talking about the Army of Northern Virginia versus the Army of the Potomac, and so they're talking about Virginia, and they don't think about the rest of the war or the other theaters of the war. But so they're talking about Lee and Jackson and maybe Jeb Stuart, the Holy Triumvirate of the Confederacy, and some others. And it's true at the beginning of the war. Well, let's look at the Army of the United States in 1861. Who was there? Well, the Army consisted of about a little more than 16,000 officers and men spread out over all the forts, all the territories, all the, in the West, everywhere. So there were four generals in the Army at the beginning of the Civil War. Brevet Lieutenant General Winfield Scott Hancock, a Virginian, 75 years old. John Wool, 77 years old. David Twiggs, 71. And the kid was William S. Harney at 60 or 61 years old. Those are the only official generals in the United States Army. Those are all big top names in Civil War, right? I mean, whoever heard of any of them, except maybe Winfield Scott. And then Brevet Brigadier General Joseph Eggleston Johnston is the fifth, if you'll admit a brevet rank, which doesn't really count officially, as Johnston was too soon to find out. Well, when the Confederate States go into creation, some of the first five generals are Samuel L. Cooper, because everybody's heard of him, right? He's number one. And then you have Albert Sidney Johnston, and then you have Robert E. Lee, and then you have, I think it's either Beauregard and Johnston or Johnston and Beauregard, and those are the top five guys. Well, of those top five guys, which one is the best general of the Civil War? Well, arguably, people are going to say Lee. Nobody ever heard of Cooper, right? And and Albert Sidney Johnston gets killed at Shiloh right away. So even though he has the reputation of being the greatest soldier of the war, he's the greatest never was of the war, because he gets killed shortly after taking command of the debacle in West Tennessee. And then you have Joe Johnston, who's fuming forever because he felt that he should top that list because he was a general before the war, but he was a quartermaster, and it was a brevet rank. So it was a staff rank, and line ranks outranked staff ranks. Too bad that didn't happen in police departments everywhere, right? It'd be the downfall of the house mouse. But these are the guys that are in charge. And then, of course, as the armies form, you start bringing in other people. Well, what about the Union Army? The top generals, Winfield Scott. He wants his top guy to be Robert E. Lee. Lee says no, can't do it, and goes the other way. So who's left? Well, Scott wants Henry Halleck, another nicknamed Old Brains. He wrote a book on field fortifications and things like that. And it's a good manual, which he basically plagiarized from the French. But and Irvin McDowell, another book soldier, he's given another brilliant man who's no longer in the Army, George B. McClellan, and then some other people are put in command. Well, people will argue that McClellan wasn't a great general, but I would argue that even though I'm not a fan of McClellan, some of the things that he put in during his tenure led to victory. So he put the pieces in place that everybody else benefited from. like the U.S. military railroads and the engineer brigade or the engineer battalion in the Army of the Potomac, and the guys who built the way to make a lot of the campaigns happen.
One
But
thing, not to cut you off, but I think one thing that you could talk about McClellan as well is that he had a great resume coming onto the job, right? He not only did he serve in the military, so he knew that, but he had also gone to the Crimea to observe that conflict. So he had experience with other militaries. And then he also was in charge of the railroad, right?
That's right.
And so he's got experience with railroads. I mean, the guy has a great resume by the time he shows up to command.
Okay, so that brings us to the South got all the good generals. Well, what exactly do people mean by that? And if you try to pinpoint one of the people who say that, they really can't answer it. Well, the South won all the battles early in the war. Well, yeah, except they didn't. And so where are you talking about? Well, Battle of Bull Run. Okay. And at Bull Run, it was Irvin McDowell, not Scott's choice. And some of the subordinate people who were now brigadier generals under him, they were winning the day. It was pausing, stopping, taking that, looking around, collecting souvenirs, and then Confederate reinforcements showing up and carrying the day. So was it a bad plan on McDowell's part, or just a bad execution of a plan? Or, to McDowell's point, you tried to get inexperienced troops to do more than they could handle in their current state of expertise, right? And so does that mean McDowell wasn't a good general because he didn't win the battle? Well, how many? Robert E. Lee lost some battles. Does that mean he wasn't a good general? So, I mean, we start getting into these rabbit holes and going down snake pits. Let's go back to the Army. Where do most of the officers come from? Most of the trained officers that served as generals in the Civil War, and I think the number is something like 400 West Point trained, United States Military Academy trained officers became generals during the course of the Civil War. At the beginning of the war, the officers in the regular Army, there's 1,108 officers serving in the United States Army. About 800 of them were trained at West Point. Of those 1,108, almost 200 were just medical officers. So that means that 700 and just shy of 800 officers who were trained at West Point are going to be the pool that are going to become, and 400 or so of them are going to become generals during the Civil War. Well, about 60 of them don't take part in the war. They're just gone. They resign and they don't pick either side. Less than 300 joined the Confederacy, which means almost 500 served the Union. So what, the South got the cream of the crop, outnumbered 5-3, and they're going to get the only good ones? Well, look who are these West Point trained officers that are going to be Civil War generals. You have U.S. Grant, you have William T. Sherman, you have William Stark Rosecrans, you have Braxton Bragg, you have A.P. Hill, going down to Corps Command level with some of these guys. You've got George Henry Thomas, another Virginian. You have a whole lot of people that go into this great general, bad general. The beginning of the war, Thomas, Grant, Sherman, McClellan, Rosecrans, all of these guys stay with the Union. All of these guys become great generals in the Civil War, I would argue. In the South, you get some people that are generals. I'm sure that the people who are saying the South got all the best generals could not possibly have been talking about Leonidas Polk. He went to West Point. The day after he graduated, he quit the Army and went to divinity school, and he became the Episcopal Bishop of Louisiana. And you had people, generals at the beginning of the war, like Gideon Pillow, who was a Mexican war veteran, but he was certainly no genius. I mean, arguably, between John Floyd, the former Secretary of War, and Gideon Pillow and Leonidas Polk, they surrendered the whole heartland of the Confederacy with their debacle on the Mississippi River and Fort Henry and Fort Donelson and Shiloh and Corinth and everything else. You have Braxton Bragg, brilliant officer, great general, who fought harder against the enemy within than the enemy without. Because his own generals despised him so much they wouldn't follow his orders. So I think when you look at it, it sounds good. It's a nice throwaway line. Oh, the South got all the good generals. Well, why? Because they won all the battles. Yeah, but if you're talking about Big Bethel and Manassas and Ball's Bluff, yeah. What big battles did the South win in 1861? What happened at Wilson's Creek? You have the Battle of Pea Ridge. You have Shiloh. You have Corinth. You have Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, Island Number 10, the capture of New Orleans, Mill Springs in Kentucky in January of 1861, the prelude to the Corinth campaign, which resulted in Fort Donelson and Shiloh, and ultimately the occupation of Corinth. So these aren't Confederate victories.
Right. Right.
What do you have? What do you have? You have nothing going on in the East until the Peninsula campaign, and then you have psychological warfare between McClellan and Lee after Lee takes command, because when Joe Johnston's in command and fights the Battle of Seven Pines, which is a debacle for both armies, with Johnston getting wounded and then Lee taking over. Okay, but prior to that, there's things going on, Jackson in the Valley, with a lot of manipulation going on from Washington, because Lincoln is disillusioned with McClellan. So you have a lot of operations where you have the amateur, even though he's in charge and authorized to do it by the Constitution, Lincoln trying to figure out how to make something happen, because he's aware of the political cost of failure at the front. And he's trying to get the generals who are reluctant to fight with green troops. Don Carlos Buell doesn't like volunteer soldiers. Well, guess what? The armies are made up of volunteer soldiers. In the East, you're one and done. If you fail, you're gone. So how do you become a good general if you have that pressure to work under? McDowell, you're gone. You fail. In the Valley, you lost. You failed. Sigel, Sigel is Sigel, but he has a reputation. He's gone. In the West, you have people like Grant, who loses a battle at Belmont, right? You have Sherman, who's forced out of the army on a leave of absence because they say he's crazy, because he says you need 200,000 men to defend the Ohio Valley. But guess what? They come back. So you're in the East, you're not allowed to make a mistake. In the West, you're allowed to make mistakes and learn from them and survive and move up. And so I think people conflate those two things. And so early in the war, there's this impression that the Federal Army is losing, but in the West, they're winning more than they lose. In the East, they're perceptibly losing more than they're winning, but they're putting the pieces in place. And the guys who are generals in 1863, most of them are still the same guys that were on their way to being generals in 1861. So who got the best?
Right. Some points you made that I, actually like is the point that, the generals that end up winning the war are in fact in the Union Army in 1861.
Yeah.
So to say that they're not there, I mean, sure, maybe they're not generals.
They're not commanding armies.
They're not commanding armies at the front, at the start, but they are still the winning team in the end.
Yeah.
And another thing you could talk about with McClellan is, during the Peninsula campaign, he gets up and right against Richmond, which, we all kind of brush aside. We like to hammer McClellan, but you can't take that away from him. He got pretty close.
Well, so he got close, and then he lost his nerve, because he had look at Phil Kearny, New Jersey. Well, he's a one-armed general, fought in Europe in the wars, comes back without an arm, and he's leading. He's one of McClellan's top guys. McClellan really likes him, but Kearny hates McClellan. He accused him of being a traitor. He accused him of everything because of not delivering that knockout blow. But this feeds into another myth about engineers that we'll discuss at some other time probably. But the engineers are cautious. Well, McClellan's a book soldier. He saw what happened. He's an expert engineer. I contend that the engineers knew about the fortifications and how deadly they were to take, and many of these guys saw service in the Mexican War. So They kind of had some idea of combat, not necessarily of command, but why, if you have all this superior force, why in the world would you send your guys to get killed if you just wait a week and pound them with 100-pounder guns?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Why not?
Why
I
not?
mean, it makes sense. And you know, and if you're Johnny, if you're Billy Yank standing in the lines and you're looking at some of these forts that they want you to go attack, and you say, well, if I just sit here, we're just going to blow it to atoms. Why? And the general's not going to make me actually go get shot at. Hey, I like this guy.
Yeah, and that's something, you know, we really hammer McClellan, but there's no doubt that he was popular with his men. That doesn't come for nothing, you know.
No,
And it's seen that poor generals were actually disliked by, you know, a lot of time by
oh, yeah, I
their
mean,
soldiers.
they might
So,
like the pomp and the flash at the beginning,
right,
but one march in the mud, and all of a sudden reality kicks in.
right.
But something happens to McClellan on the peninsula that also feeds into that ultimate failure of that campaign. He's saddled with corps commanders that he doesn't pick and that he doesn't want. If you believe McClellan, and I'll give him, I'm 51-49 with waiting for the mail-in ballots to show up about McClellan. He gets saddled with corps commanders in rank order. Now, most of the guys on that list are these stalwart generals like Erasmus Keyes, great Civil War general, right? And so McClellan gets saddled with these guys, and they're in rank order off of the list of seniority, which we talked about earlier. He doesn't want those guys, and all those guys are not politically in step with McClellan. So what he does is he divides, and this is going to be something that he does that has a long-lasting effect on the war. But how do you conduct a campaign with handpicked subordinates that don't like you or that you don't trust or respect? It makes it very difficult. Ask Braxton Bragg. So it's not quite as bad, but it's comparable to what happens in the way that campaign unfolds. So does that mean McClellan wasn't a good general if you've got these people that you don't trust to do the job and that don't have the experience to do it? None of them did on either side. So these sort of throwaway phrases like, oh, the best generals or the this or the that, to me, I have little patience with them. I like to get down and look at who were these guys, what's the relationship between them, and how did they operate, and what could they have done differently? Maybe like Pope was saddled, the Army of Virginia, Pope was saddled with 3 guys he doesn't want. How do you expect him to be successful?
So, you know, in summary, you know, bringing it to a close, how would we say that dispelling this myth, this kind of off the cuff remark that people make, how does that help us better understand the Civil War and help us with how we, you know, research the Civil War?
Well, I think if you start off with a false premise, you get to false conclusions. So you have to, in order to understand the war, I think number one, you have to look at who were those first 4 generals. Now, not one of them, except Scott, is a factor in the Civil War. Harney, yeah, okay, in Missouri in the West, but he's not really, after 1861, early 1862, you never hear about Harney anymore. The other guys are just, they're there in staff positions, or Twiggs is just gone. I think he goes with the South, but they're not field commanders. There are no field commanders. Prior to the Civil War, nobody commanded more than a few companies. Richard Stoddard Ewell, an old bald head from the Army of Northern Virginia, he wrote that before the Civil War, he learned everything about commanding 100 dragoons in Texas and nothing else. Now he's commanding a corps. After Chancellorsville, he's commanding a corps in the Army of Northern Virginia. He wasn't fit to lead a corps. Nobody was. And that's something we don't understand. The biggest armies in the Mexican War, 2 of them, Zachary Taylor had about 10,000, and Winfield Scott had about 12 to 15,000 men at their peak. A weak Army Corps in the Civil War is 10,000 men. The Army of the Potomac is 100,000 men. Nobody commanded that ever in American history prior to when it actually happened. And so that's true on both sides. And excuse me, I think luck of the draw, if you look at the officers, that 795 number of officers from West Point at the beginning of the war, 2/3 of them stay with the Union. 1/3 of them goes with the Confederacy. And it's not just along. If you actually look at some of the documentation, you have many Northerners who go south and many Southerners who go north. Actually, there's more Northern officers who go with the Confederacy than there are Confederate officers who go with the Union. And it's because of who they married and where they were living. Like John Pemberton from Pennsylvania, who goes south because his wife was from the South. We got George Henry Thomas from Virginia. He becomes an Army commander and he leads the Army of the Cumberland. He was there at the beginning of the war. Isn't he a great general? Well, ask the guys who named him the Rock of Chickamauga. So I think why it's important is that you have to look at the big picture and see how all these puzzle pieces fit into place, and don't get the wrong picture. Get the right picture. This was the building blocks for both sides were already in place. They were already in the box of puzzle pieces at the beginning of the war. There was no magical warrior that came from outer space to come in and help one side over the other. They learned on the job, and attrition or politics or being in the right place at the right time played out like it does for most of us.
And I think that in the greatest documentary ever, the Gettysburg movie, doesn't Stephen Lang Pickett say something like, they got all the good ones, or they got all the smart ones, huh? And look what got them. So there you go. He admits it.
But but also I think some of these generalities, because God help us if we all sat down and every day we had to open up 42 books to find one fact or to verify it and underscore it and make it acceptable to a state's attorney somewhere, it wouldn't be fun.
Right.
What's fun is being able to make the generalities, or look at the person, or take the cheap shot jokes like headquarters in the saddle or something like this, because they're fun. You go, haha, that's funny, and it makes some of the horror stuff more digestible, because you have these other things that you can look to and try to create a shell of this is why things unfolded the way they did.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show, clearing that up for us. And as I've said before, I'm definitely going to put a link to your website in the description below so people can get access to you. And as I've said before, please, anyone who has a Civil War roundtable or, the Sons of Union Veterans, Historical Society on campus, definitely look this guy up, because this is a wealth of knowledge and he will definitely keep your members entertained for sure. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, sir.